So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Doug Saunders. His bio's in your materials, so rather than going through the detail of that, most of which is completely fascinating, I'd like to actually take a minute and quote from a couple of articles he's written. Because Doug, among the reasons that we asked Doug to close the conference was the fact that what he has written on over the past weeks and months and years actually informs a lot of this debate. And so from an article just a couple of days ago, Doug wrote, "The idea of shutting down the entire government and economy for a month every summer was probably invented in Athens 2,500 years ago. And it's caught on. Starting this weekend, the entire European continent will grind to a halt as 500 million people head for one another's beaches for a month. When they return in September, there'll be new clarity. The world of Americans and Europeans will have transformed from one of crisis to one labeled recovery. Growth is returning to Germany, Britain, the US, and other big centers, and the troubled economies of Greece, Spain, and Ireland are being repaired in relatively non-harmful ways by intelligent governments. But a return to growth is not a certainty. That's now gone forever. Certainty, as I've learned during my 6-country tour in which I visited scores of Europeans in their homes and workplaces, is the main victim of the crash. No longer are jobs, houses, savings, or futures secure in the Western world. And that's the question now looming over the world: what's stable and reliable? What worked? What sort of life is worth pursuing? What sort of policy and leadership is worth electing, if so much can melt away in an instant?" A couple of days before that, Doug reflected on the question of, was the boom worth it? And it was Liam Corrigan, a 51-year-old heating technician I met in Dublin, who made the point, in the end, you really have to ask yourself whether it was worth all the hype. He made good money in the 15-year boom and bought a 5-bedroom house only to watch the work dry up and his house disappear. Now he's living in a rented apartment, earning what he did in 1994, as if the whole thing had been an odd and very Irish sort of dream. Was it worth it? Are we all like Liam Corrigan? As the economy begins to recover, we ought to be asking whether the crash of '08 wiped out all the gains, national and personal, that were created in the long boom, or are people still better off than they were when it all began? And he goes on to say, in Canada, the answer is an unambiguous yes. So, Doug, we've had 3.5 days of thoughtful consideration of crises as turning points. I'd now like to turn this over to you so that you can knit the various pieces together and give us your thoughts on the topic. Ladies and gentlemen, Doug Saunders. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thank you, everyone. I'll confess, my first time at Couchiching. I've followed the debates here over many years and been fascinated by some of the experiences and speeches here, but I'll confess my physical knowledge of the Couchiching conference comes mainly from Stephen Wysensay's novel In Praise of Older Women, where the denouement of that novel, of course, takes place at this conference, and it gave me the real sense that this is a place of roiling romantic opportunity and so on. So, on that note, I'd like you to all to meet Elizabeth Renzetti, my wife, and who actually knows Stephen Wysensay. And based possibly on that, she thought it would be a very wise idea to come along with me. But seriously, I think you all agree with me this is an especially important Couchiching conference, given the historic moment that's being addressed. I think David McGowan deserves enormous credit for focusing this conference so tightly on the subject of this transitional moment in Canada's history, in the world's history, in the economy. Whatever that means, I think most of us share a feeling that something large and important has changed during these past 2 years. That we're entering some new kind of era, or at least a time during which we're going to have to think about the old certainties in different ways. I don't know if we can agree, though, what exactly it is that has changed. It could be, sometimes I think we're entering the end of the post-war era, the 65 or 70-year period when essentially everything in the economy and in many social areas was dominated by the United States. It could also be that the stability of the petroleum-backed economy has ended for good, as we've just discussed in the previous panel. Or that it's the end of a certain sort of Western economy backed by a low-cost, pliant, developing world that's ending. Maybe we're entering an era of real globalization, whatever that means. So what's going to happen next after this crisis, whether or not we're in recovery now, I don't know. I think Margaret Macmillan did a fantastic job of summarizing the present moment and the historic past, and I don't think that's something that I can do. I cannot predict the future. I think if we've learned anything in the past 2 years, it's that it's a bad idea to build anything around expectations of future returns, whether it's a conference speech or an asset-backed commercial paper. But I'd like to talk about the places in the world where serious and historic change does seem to be occurring. And I might disappoint some of you by not focusing so much on Canada or on Europe, which I cover for the Globe and Mail, because I think they get a lot of attention, and I think the changes that seem to have the largest effect on the larger world economy are occurring elsewhere at the moment, although they are occurring in our backyard as a direct result. While the Western world has just witnessed the end of a certain type of economic stability, I think in the less wealthy 2/3 of the world, there really was no crisis in that same sense. There was, however, a period of enormous and tumultuous change that is still going on that I'd say they are midway through. In most of these Asian, African, and South American countries, we're witnessing a dramatic and tumultuous shift, much like what Europe and North America experienced during the 19th century, a complete redistribution of the basis of society from subsistence agriculture to urbanized production. And maybe we've forgotten just how disruptive and dangerous that period was for us and how lucky we were to get through it without so much damage. I think it's risky to draw historic parallels. Things don't, there's no fixed stages of growth that countries and cultures go through that are exactly the same. But I think we do have to keep an eye on the transformations that are going on around the world as drivers. To that end, I've just finished a 3-year project in which I visited about 20 countries on 5 continents, doing field study in the urban outskirts, in the shanty towns and the rural villages of these countries. And the book I've produced from that work, Arrival City, focuses on the transitional urban neighborhoods, which I argue are going to be the major centers of political and social change. I'm not going to give you that argument here. I think you'll get enough of that in the next couple of months as I come back here to promote that book and so on. I'm not going to repeat its arguments. Instead, I'd like to shift our attention away from the big, noisy centers and talk about 3 villages I've recently visited, which I think show us 3 aspects of this possible future. I want to focus on these marginal places because I think we too easily become focused on the big, noisy centers and the noisy, easily observable ideas. The reason why I think we in the media especially are guilty of this, we failed to notice the bolus of bad credit that was clogging up the banking system until it was too late. We failed to notice climate change in any serious way on our front pages until it was almost too late. And I think that's because we were looking in the wrong places and because we have a tendency to look at the big, noisy, easily observable things. When we try to guess what lies in the future, we tend to stick to the tropes of war, finance, political leadership. Now, at this moment in history, I think there's probably less war than at any time in modern history in terms of the number of people in the world who are affected by it and the geographic expanse that's affected by it. Certainly, the tragic events and our own role in them deserves coverage, so I'm not downplaying that. Finance, public and private, remains very important, but its peaks and troughs affect a surprisingly small number of people in the world. I'd say in a village in Nigeria or Brazil, the financial crisis of the last 2 years was experienced mainly as background noise. And large-scale politics, I think the last really major shift occurred in 1989 and 1990. And today we have an interesting tension between liberal democracies and what are now typically called state capitalisms. But I don't think anyone's pretending that those forms of leadership and the tension between them is the primary force in this world. It's more effect than cause in some ways. I think we need to ask the larger question, what are most people in the world today actually experiencing? What are they planning on doing with themselves that's different, that's going to push things along? And what forces are pressing on their lives? What will this era be remembered for, in other words? And what I see on the ground in the margins in China and Brazil and Bangladesh and Nigeria are a set of 5 tensions at work that I think are going to have to resolve themselves one way or another in the next couple decades that cannot stay as they are. One is the supply of food and its price and availability. Second is the problem of population growth. Third is the threat of premature death, of starvation, sanitary infection, communicable disease, and so on. Fourth is the ability of women and girls to lead full and equal lives, which I think we've realized now is not a incidental topic, but it is a root cause of many other things. And the fifth is what we could say is the maintenance of a livable ecological balance, which for people on the ground manifests itself, I think, first as the availability of basic resources, but also increasingly the effects of temperature increases and ocean level rises. And if you watch closely, you realize that all 5 of these things are part of one big thing. They're the same problem. And the people who are victims of these 5 things, the people who don't have enough food, those who see their children die of preventable disease, those who live in places where women aren't educated or treated as domestic animals, those who stand to be devastated by the effects of climate change or rising ocean levels, these are almost universally people who live in subsistence-level rural villages. It is the persistence of this subsistence agricultural living that is the major root cause of all these problems. If we look at climate change, for example, we can alleviate it in 3 ways. By reducing carbon emissions through policy, which I think is possible, but we've not had great success at. By reducing the number of humans, and therefore the number of people emitting. And by reducing the proportion of humans who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We now know that it tends to be the families that live on $1 a day or less who are vulnerable to water level rises and temperature increases. So you could reduce the proportion of people who are going to be affected. The second 2 solutions are tied almost exclusively to the problem of subsistence agriculture, which is responsible for most of the population growth and most of the climate vulnerability in the world. Vulnerability is the hallmark of subsistence rural life. And to understand the different ways these 5 problems could affect our economy and our political future, I'd like to take you to 3 villages that I've visited recently. The first one is in the very center of India, a very hot place in eastern Maharashtra. It's called Dorli. It's a small cluster of mud huts in the middle of cotton fields. It's a very hot and dry place, kind of pretty. They tend to whitewash their huts there in a characteristic light blue color around there. But very, very poor. I was touring villages in this region when I decided to visit this one because it had a big banner on the outer mud wall of the village saying, "This village is up for sale, including houses, animals, and farms." And so I sat down on the dirt floor of one of the huts with the elders there, and I realized they meant what they wrote very sincerely. It wasn't some activist prank. They wanted a businessman, in their words, to buy the whole village and maybe turn it into the sort of a factory or something like that. They didn't know much about agricultural investments. They knew about Tata Company and things like this. And they wanted its 290 residents to be paid a couple $1,000s each to get out of there forever after dozens of generations in the village. They had watched as the villages around them, and to a large extent their own, had been stricken with suicides, terrible diseases of malnutrition, devastating bankruptcies, alcoholism, drug addiction, family bankruptcy. This is a region where the farms, starting maybe 70 years ago, became to be divided among the sons each generation, rather than primogeniture, where you just pass it to the oldest son. I don't know what caused it to change. But as a result, people here were having 3 or 4 sons each. They still have large families, so there were no options here for the other sons to move to the city. So the farms have become smaller and smaller over the generations until most people had plots of land too small to farm in any commercially useful way, or even really to provide for the family unless there was a particularly good growing season. The result that any small downturn in weather or growing conditions or cotton markets would ruin you. You wouldn't literally die of starvation. India does have enough of a social system sometimes to prevent that. And there are aid agencies that are supposed to watch out for that, but your children would be eating so little they didn't have the energy to go to school, which is a long way away. You'd borrow from local loan sharks to feed your kids, and you'd plant your next year's crop. And the only way out of debt was to do what a lot of guys there were doing, which is to wander into the middle of the field and drink a whole bottle of agricultural pesticide and end your life. And the people of Dorley are victims of two things: overpopulation, agricultural underinvestment. Why is there no investment in a country that needs food? In large part because the Indian government, like too many governments, is obsessed with maintaining the small family farm rather than ending its primacy. It has attached to the romantic idea of the family farm. You might say that the people of Dorley would have been better off if in the most miserable sewage-infested slum of Bombay. And as luck would have it, that is exactly what they wanted to do with the couple $1,000s each. They wanted to move into the worst slums of Mumbai. But they couldn't, because the worst slums of Mumbai are now too expensive for subsistence-level farmers like this. It's actually the better-off farmers who've saved for a few years who can afford to get into the very worst slums, because the very worst slums mean a tenfold improvement almost in your quality of living by almost any measure compared to a subsistence rural village in India and almost anywhere else in the world. Their total lack of access to the city was preventing them from developing. There are a lot of places like Dorley in the world today, especially in India and Bangladesh, you notice it, and certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, places where people are trapped on the land, and the land is therefore not producing food for the whole country or for export. And this is partly a root of the food crises of the last couple of years. 3/4 of the people suffering from hunger in the world live in villages like Dorley. And of the billion families in the world who live on less than $1 a day, 3/4 of them live in villages like Dorley. These underinvested villages are the largest single killers of humans in the world today, I would argue. The second village I visited is in the very center of China. It's called Shuilin in Sichuan province. You reach it by walking on an elevated mud path above flooded paddy fields. And there you find a cluster of maybe 300 people living in wooden concrete block houses, a very nice, peaceful, tranquil place, sort of the vision of the Chinese rural. Up until the end of the 1970s, it was not unusual for people here to starve to death in good numbers. When there was a famine, and famines are usually more political than climate, you'd have children dying in the village. In the terrible famine of the late 50s and early 60s, I think they lost half their population. People don't starve there anymore. The Chinese government has effectively ended that. But in fact, in this village in Shuilin, the houses have all been improved considerably. Some of them have satellite dishes, and there's more than enough food to go around. But what struck me about Shuilin was the complete lack of any parents. There were absolutely no adults in the entire village, or in any village around there, in fact, of child-rearing age, or in fact, Chinese villages in a great many provinces. There are many small children here. In rural China, people tend to ignore the one-child rule. And there were grandparents. The children spent their nights sleeping on straw mats, curled up next to their grannies, usually with the livestock in the next room. And they spent their mornings being taken to school by their grandparents over huge distances. They knew their parents only through once-a-week cell phone conversations, and saw them once every year or maybe 2 years during the Spring Festival holiday. And their parents, and all the parents in this village, and in fact all the parents at almost any village I could visit, had gone to the cities of the Pearl River Delta or to Chongqing to work in the factories and sweatshops. And we know there are, in a country of 1 billion people, there are 200 million Chinese, as we learned in the panel yesterday, living like this, with 1 foot in the village, 1 foot in the city, without really being able to fully have either. And a shocking number of them are living away from their children and their families for an entire generation. This created this psychological shock of a lost generation. Children who are raised by their grandparents, and right when they're in their most vulnerable teen years, are going to have to deal with the senility and death of the only adults they've loved. The farms are this way because they serve as a social safety net in China, a place to house and educate your children and to accumulate your savings, because the government doesn't provide any education or social security or pensions or unemployment insurance or health care to those 200 million rural migrants. The Chinese Communist Party has made it almost impossible to resolve this situation, despite promises every couple of years that the policies had changed. In large part, I think, because China's economy relies on this ambiguity. Because they have no safety net, these 200 million peasants, the floating population as it's called, are forced to save every penny they earn and to go through kind of grotesque rituals of austerity and personal savings, and put this money into state-owned banks to save for their futures. And those hundreds of billions of dollars of peasant savings are China's main source of investment capital in the most important enterprises and so on. And because it is so secure and freely available, this pot of savings, it means that China can afford to issue a large number of what are effectively non-performing loans to businesses. There's a great worry that if you pull out the table leg of the peasant savings, a lot of trouble within the Chinese economy is going to become crashing down. Another result of this is that Chinese agriculture is not as developed as it should be, because hundreds of millions of small peasant farms are serving as social safety nets rather than agricultural enterprises. China, therefore, is investing in Africa, perhaps for better, perhaps for worse, in order to provide its own food stability. And the cities aren't developing properly either, because people from the villages, who are the great sources of entrepreneurship, aren't able to build a proper stake there, to buy land, to get housing together, to move their whole families in, to invest in the city's growth. This is not just China. These hollow villages, as they're known in China, can be found throughout Eastern Europe. Certainly in Romania, they're a huge problem. In Russia, Turkey, and very large parts of Africa. There's a pent-up tension in these villages that's going to force, I think, a very sudden change in a lot of places. The third village I visited is located geographically between the other two, in northern Bangladesh, far away from any major city, in the very poor and remote Sylhet district. It's called Bijwanath, and it has almost 1,000 people in it. It's a big village, and it's also a rice farming village. And until recently, it was even poorer and more starvation-prone than the ones in China or India. The people of northern Bangladesh were among the poorest people in the world, living on pennies a day. But something's happened in Bijwanath and in all the villages around it. You drive down its mud roads, or sometimes you can't even drive, they barely have roads there. And you pass the little wood shacks with dirt floors that families had lived in for hundreds of years. And every kilometer or so, you come across an absolutely monstrous house, 3 or 4 stories, concrete, done in sort of the style of Dubai or the Gulf states, with a big circular driveway like an English country manor outside. And these huge houses are usually empty almost all the time because their owners only live in them a few weeks a year. They're called Londani houses because the people who own them are Bangladeshi villagers who've moved to East London, where they work in curry restaurants or clothing shops or computer help desks or so on. And these people are poor by London standards, living in poor public housing apartments often, but in the village they're something like feudal lords. The few £100 a month that they send to Bijwanath are enough to provide 30 or 40 jobs each around the house, harvesting the family's rice fields, taking care of the house, running shops started by the family. So on the edge of the Londani houses, you get these shanty towns of lean-to shacks accumulating, and you get an immigrant boom into the Londani house from even poorer regions of Bangladesh, with people coming into the Londani villages for work. So the international migration boom from the Indian subcontinent to Britain is creating an internal immigration boom as an end effect. And when I first visited Bijwanath, it looked like a strange kind of feudalism. These people would come visiting like lords and showering gifts on people and wasting money on building shops with escalators in a place where people earn less than $1 a day as families and so on, and expensive running shoe shops and so on. And it seemed like it's almost a display of wealth and success. But as the economic downturn has kicked in, which, by the way, the downturn has actually caused remittances to countries like Bangladesh, whose largest source of foreign exchange is remittance from families living abroad, to increase. Nevertheless, these people have been visiting a lot less often, and it's caused the investment of the Londani money to shift toward actually causing the fields to be productive, and to switching from 2 rice harvests a year to 3, families consolidating their fields and starting to turn from the subsistence style of rice farming into actual commercial cash crop farming, and building up transportation routes to Dhaka, which is a terribly under-provided city with food. Bangladesh is a net importer of food in its country that should be able to produce many times its own needs. So you're starting to see this change happening. And you see villages like this in a lot of places around the world, in Central America, in North Africa, with the remittance money and, from immigrants in Europe, in the United States, sent to their home villages, has become the major source of capitalization in agricultural investment because policies in the domestic countries or the international investment market are not providing agricultural investment. So, 3 villages, 3 fates, and really 3 ways of being connected to the global economy. In Dorlee, a complete disconnect, except through information. People there know how badly they're doing. As opposed to their grandparents, they know that fate does not require them to starve or to go into debt or so on. And they're struggling to do something. In Sri Lin, you have a village that is no longer about subsistence farming, but about providing labor and capital to the global economy in a way that's ripping apart families and cities at the moment. And in the Londani village of Bijwanath, you have a place that is so intricately tied to the global economy, right down to the very name Londani village, that is being developed by that global economy precisely because its people have left. Often leaving is the best way to improve a place. These 3 villages, I would argue, are characteristic of millions and millions of other places like this around the world. There's a tension palpable in most rural villages in the developing world right now, a sense that large-scale change is about to occur. People are aware of it. Everyone who earns under $1 a day, I've found, has a cell phone these days. They're well connected to the city informationally. They know it. That change is coming, and it's coming from a city somewhere. These villages and the cities that they're linked to are being transformed by the 2 forces that I actually can say with some certainty will be taking place during the 21st century. So yeah, this is a prediction. And then we know, based on reliable projections from the United Nations, that within the next 50 years, 2 things will happen. The first will be the end of continuous human population growth. We know that the world's population will peak at some level, 9 billion if we're lucky, 12 billion if we're quite unlucky, and even higher if things go horribly wrong, and that it will begin to decline at some point this century. We don't know exactly when or how high the peak will be, but it'll make a big difference to many of the things we've been discussing. The second thing will be the end of the shift that humans began undergoing 10,000 years ago in Iraq, actually, I believe, Mesopotamia, from subsistence agriculture to the cities. By the end of this century, the whole world will be as urban as Canada and Western Europe and North America are. That is between 75% and 95% urban. With first, South America is almost there now, and the Middle East is almost there. Asia, at some point in the next 40 or 50 years, will reach that threshold, and Africa a little bit after that. We know from centuries of experience that once this shift happens, it tends to be largely irreversible, unless it occurs as a result of armed conflict, in which case it reverses very quickly. So 2 momentous transitions, the urban transition and the population transition, as they're known, are now on the verge of reaching their peak in parts of the world that were not terribly much affected by the economic crisis. Of course, they're not 2 different transitions, they're the same thing. The population will stop growing because places urbanize. People stop having more than 2 children each when they move to the cities almost universally. Look at Iran. In the 1980s, it had 7 children per family, and now it has 1.7 because of urbanization, against the wishes of the religious leaders. And the way that these developing countries urbanize will determine how soon and at what level the world's population stops growing. It's a crucial policy issue for these countries, and for us, really. And we don't know how these will play out or their precise after effects. The way it happens could be violent and divisive and revolutionary, as it often was for us. Look at the French Revolution, which I'd say was a direct product of the nature of rural to urban transition. Or it could create a new prosperity, a new middle class, a new equality, a new sustainability in ecological terms. We're not on the sidelines of this in Canada. Our future, I'd say, is tied to these transitions. First of all, because our people are linked in intensive ways to these places. There are as many, I would say, Torontoni villages in the world as there are Londoni villages. And more importantly, we'll be trying to stay aloft in a world economy that's shifting from population growth to population shrinkage and engaging, as we see in China so much, in the tumultuous effects of trying to manage that change. So the crisis that began in 2008 may well be remembered as the final crisis of a growing world. I hope it is, because that would give us 40 years without a crisis, so it'd be all right. We're facing a new watershed moment. I imagine that at some point we'll have a conference here about the watershed in human population. Probably within my lifetime, if I can live to be 80 or so, certainly within my children's lifetime. And this watershed, the next one, will be driven not by finance, or not directly by finance, but by human movement. And it could be our salvation, or it could be our next great catastrophe, depending on how we handle it. Thank you.